Shall we talk about this quality adjusted life here? And I think you've described some of this as macabre to a certain extent, but it's worth having the conversation of, I know it's hard to talk about this, but what is a life worth? And then I know I've seen some of your analysis that if you save a life, how many years of life does that give the person back? Is it an average of 10 years, et cetera? Because like you said, if this goes into 60 days, 90 days, we might have to have these honest questions and say, okay, if we're saving 20,000 lives, is that worth, 50 billion cost to the economy? Can you talk people through how you go through that logic and how you try to get over the emotional side of that argument?
Well, you're right. I mean, it's a slightly macabre topic, and it's one which, although governments have to make decisions on these kind of trade-offs every day, they prefer in some sense not to focus on in public. I mean, I say that governments have to make these decisions all the time. And obviously, when you decide that the speed limit on your motorway system is going to be 70 miles an hour rather than 90 or 50, you are essentially trading off the likelihood of more lives lost if people can drive at 90 miles an hour than you're trading that off against the benefits that people get to where they want to go quicker. And we don't have a speed limit on the roads in the UK of 10 miles an hour. If we did, there'd be far fewer fatalities. But of course, the cost of people never being able to go more than 10 miles an hour would be immense. So we don't do that. And in fact, the Department of Transport in the UK has effectively got a rule about how costly it is to lose a life in a car crash. And they trade that off against the benefits of people being able to go a little bit faster. Something happens in the National Health Service here in the UK, which is even more explicit than that. And this is where I think one can make a calculation about the value of a saved extra year of life. And the National Health Service rule goes like this. It says, if there is a treatment that you could introduce in hospitals in the UK in our National Health Service, which would save on average 1 extra year of life if you apply the treatment, then as long as that treatment costs less than £30,000, one should apply the treatment. But if it costs more than £30,000, it doesn't pass what you might call the sort of resource allocation rule. And I think you have to have a rule like that. Otherwise, you end up saying, well, anything that looks like it might increase one's chances of living a bit longer, however expensive it is, we should do it. And you would end up having a tax rate of 98% in the UK, and nearly the whole of GDP would be spent on the health service. And of course, that would be crazy. Nobody would want that. No government could get elected if it did that. And this £30,000 per treatment that might save you an extra year of life is the rule that guides resource allocation in the National Health Service. And in a piece of analysis that I did a little while ago, I tried to apply that rule to see whether the lockdown that we had in the UK starting in March, eventually lasting about 3 months, passed that kind of test, given different possible scenarios about how many lives were saved as a result of a 3-month lockdown.
Right.
And, to summarize just the results very briefly, what that suggested was that keeping the lockdown in place for as long as 3 months may have generated costs that were very high relative to the likely benefits. And therefore, a 3-month lockdown in the UK looks extremely expensive given the costs and the benefits of having it in place.
And if I was maybe just to generalize some of the assumptions you made about that model, I think you said if you save a life, roughly 10 years of life you might save for that person, times the 30,000, I guess that's 300,000 pounds you would potentially save with each life. Is that a rough idea?
Yes, in a way that's right. So, I mean, if you looked at the average age of people who, tragically have died with COVID, it's somewhere in the sort of low 80s. If you asked what was the life expectancy of people of that typical age, at best, probably it was about 10 years, probably actually a little bit less, given that most of the people who died at that age with COVID had related health problems. So if you then said, well, okay, suppose you apply that National Health Service rule, how many resources using the NHS rule would you want to apply to saving, on average, those kind of lives? And the answer would be, as you say, £300,000 or £400,000. Now, I stress again, this looks like a very macabre thing to do. It looks like the kind of thing a kind of heartless economist would do, attaching money values to lives saved. But the reality is that that's how decisions are made in public health systems in pretty much every country in the world, and in other areas where governments have to make rules. How fast can people drive on our roads, for example? So it was simply applying that kind of rule. And I think had that analysis said, well, it was a close run thing, whether the lockdown for 3 months was sensible or not, I think I'd have been much more open-minded about it. But I think as it turned out, the numbers suggested that the costs were so much higher than the £30,000 per QALY rule would have justified, that it seemed to me you'd have to go way beyond that National Health Service rule to have justified restrictions, blanket restrictions kept in place for as long as we did back in the spring and into the summer here in the UK.